For more than 2 months, India and China were locked in an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation. As the world watched with bated breath, two Asian giants stood at the brink of a military clash. India, under its current leadership, stood its ground, unrelenting. New Delhi wasn't in the wrong, and it refused to be bullied or browbeaten by its neighbour. Eventually, good sense prevailed in Beijing and Doklam was diffused. As the world heaved a sigh of relief, the Chinese were back to playing their sly games, clearly having learned no lessons from this episode, provoking India again. WION has learnt through its sources that Chinese forces have intruded into Indian territory multiple times since the Doklam episode. There have been as many as 20 incursions in Ladakh, and this is in Ladakh alone since the 12th of October. In fact, one was recorded as recently as the 7th of November. This is what we know so far. Chinese troops have made 8 incursions in Ladakh in October as well as this month. They came inside the Indian territory as deep as 7 kilometers. 7 incursions have been recorded in Ladakh's Despong area. Here, Chinese troops went as deep as 19 kilometers. Beyond the jeeps, Chinese troops have even used boats and choppers to intrude into the Indian side. An incursion by 2 Chinese choppers was also recorded in Uttarakhand's Rimkhim. This is what we know so far. Let's go straight to our guest this evening, Ainar Thangan, political and economic commentator with us from Beijing, and Professor Swaran Singh from the School of International Studies at the JNU with us from New Delhi. Good evening to both of you. Professor Singh, let me begin with you. What should we make of this provocation? Are you surprised that China is back at playing these games so soon after the 73-day-long standoff?
I think, first of all, it is clear that we have a very long boundary which is disputed. Second, we all understand that in August, at end of August, when Doklam standoff finally came to a disengagement, this was clearly given China's compulsions of holding BRICS summit and Indian Prime Minister not confirming his visit. So it was done to a certain extent under duress as far as Chinese see it. Second, it's also important to understand that for Chinese, Indian forces had pushed Chinese soldiers back, and that was an emotional hurt to their armed forces. So fundamentally, they were bound to come back, they were bound to continue these incursions. So almost 1 incursion on average every day is happening since then. And what we are hearing is that they are learning lessons from what happened in Doklam standoff of 72 days. They are reinforcing their positions in Doklam and other areas. They are also trying to engage Bhutan and Nepal much more seriously. So definitely this is going to happen sooner or later. Normal assumption is that winter months are not good time to really do such a provocation. But if you remember, in Kargil, we had a similar kind of a tacit understanding with Pakistan, which was breached. So it is not necessary that they will not do another provocation in winter months again. But we also notice that Indian side is taking note of these, and not only Defence Minister has gone to forward areas in various sectors. We had President's visit recently to Arunachal Pradesh where he addressed the local assembly. And of course, armed forces are preparing and ordering new equipment. And as much as 50 new posts are being planned on the border. So Indian side, I think, is quite in grip of the situation. They understand what is happening. So it's fundamentally, I think, a very piecemeal escalation, which you already detailed about how boats and helicopters are being used now for these incursions. So it's not just simply the frequency of incursions, but the nature of incursions is changing. And the whole narrative from China, which we noticed from 19th Party Congress, and the way Xi Jinping in his opening speech asserted that Chinese sovereignty will be protected, armed forces will be modernized not only to fight but also win wars. So that kind of language also is giving certain signals to their forces on the ground, which also would accordingly perhaps be far more aggressive in their actual operations on the ground. So this is going to, I think, very gradually escalate and will continue to show certain provocations here and there.
Well, protecting Chinese sovereignty is one thing, and breaching someone else's is quite another, and that is the case here. Ainar, 20 incursions, one up to 19 kilometers into Indian territory. What is China trying to do?
Well, first off, we have to be careful about what we say are actual facts. we don't know that there have been 20 incursions. You said that you have sources, but we haven't been able to pinpoint those. In terms of talking to the Chinese side, they say they are unaware of any such activity. So once again, we have a difference in perception or facts. You say that it's there, unnamed sources, the Chinese side say it's not. So going beyond that, though, it flies in the face of Chinese continued efforts to engage India and have India be part of the Belt and Road, of trying to create a better Asia. You can concentrate on the activities and the speech that Xi Jinping gave, but I think if you look at it, he talked about peaceful development and the ability to spread what China has achieved throughout the region, not in an aggressive way, but in a way that can benefit all, a win-win situation.
All for that, but the actions don't match the words, it seems. Professor Singh, how do you see the government of India responding?
I think government of India is trying to play a very balanced game where you have repeatedly, at the political level, Prime Minister is engaging Chinese leaders. He had recent meeting when he visited the East Asian Summit. He met Li Keqiang. And his earlier 3 summits with the President Xi Jinping also gave a signal of kind of maturity of understanding on both sides, and something called Astana Consensus is fundamentally a commitment on both sides that they will not allow differences to become disputes. Then at the level of diplomacy, we are repeatedly saying we are engaging Chinese. We had this working mechanism for consultations and coordination on border affairs meeting on 18th this month. So diplomacy is engaging and armed forces are preparing for eventualities that could happen in future. So I think it's a well-coordinated response that India has. But sometimes it looks like that perhaps diplomacy is far more assertive in denying that there are escalations on the border. I think in that sense, armed forces also need to put their point across to the media saying what is their assessment of the border, so that there is an understanding in common people's mind as to how gradually the escalation is taking place on ground, and how then therefore it is justified to really equip armed forces, provide them necessary budgets and other things.
Right.
And that has been justified in public in that sense. What we hear much more is diplomatic engagement, which is repeatedly denying any escalation.
Einar, was the Doklam resolution only to ensure India's attendance at the BRICS summit, and now that that purpose has been achieved, China goes back to its old ways? What I'm trying to understand is what's the point of this needling? What is the strategy?
Well, you keep saying that China is going back to its old ways. I mean, you know, we could continue arguing about Doklam in terms of who crossed which border and what happened there and who was at fault. And let us say that there was a tremendous sigh of relief from China's side in trying to reconcile this matter. This was not a sense, you didn't see people jumping up and down the streets or declaring victory against China, India. What you saw was a very measured response by China, which is trying to engage India. I don't understand where this idea that somehow it is to the benefit of either China or India to have any kind of clash along its borders. We are not talking about strategically sensitive areas. We are talking about pasture lands. These are places that are largely uninhabited except by goat herders. So the idea that this is somehow a strategic war that's being waged by two sides over something important has absolutely no basis in fact. So when my fellow commentator starts reading in, or you start adding in this idea that there's some nefarious idea on China's side, I ask a simple question. What on earth has China to gain from this? And quite frankly, everything to lose. So once again, China is trying to extend this idea. I think there is some sensitivity on the Indian side because you're building more and more roads, citing this eventuality of. I just hope this will not be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I think we're both asking the same question. I'm asking you the same thing. What does China gain from this? Why this needling? And you're saying it, but we're, of course, coming from different places. But let me ask this to Professor Swaran Singh, and I want you to respond to what Einar said about India's sensitivities and why this may not be the case as we are presenting it. Also, Ladakh is a different ball game. How is India poised on this front vis-a-vis China?
I think across the border, India, I'm reminded of recent comment by Dalai Lama saying that Indians are lazy compared to Chinese. So across the border, Chinese have been able to build their infrastructure relatively faster. And Indian, infrastructure building has been relatively slow moving. From 2005 onwards, we are hearing of 73 roads to be built in border, in frontier areas. And possibly 29 are completed so far. We have issues of our federalism where sometimes states move in a different direction than where the union government wants them to go. So those are inherent limitations in terms of infrastructure on the border. And then, of course, also equipment and other issues that armed forces keep raising once in a while. But fundamentally, Einar asked a question, what will China gain by doing such needling? It's important to note that the national narrative of China has changed under President Xi Jinping. It is no longer talk of the century of humiliation. It is talk of China dream. It is talk of rejuvenation of nation, where what China thinks is its sovereign territory, it is trying to unilaterally do muscle flexing to, put its, feet on the ground in those areas. So it's fundamentally saying that what China thinks is their territory will be taken by them by possibly force, if not by negotiations. And that is showing implications for all the neighbors of China in that sense, India included in that. So if you notice that the comments that they make, for example, when Indian president goes to Arunachal Pradesh, is uncalled for, because if border is disputed, de facto reality is that right now that territory belongs to India and Indian president should visit there. Why not? Only when it is resolved, we will see where the territory goes and to whom it belongs. But to keep responding to each of these visits in a manner as if China is dictating Indian leaders not to visit those areas is an assertion of China's new power which they have gained. So in that sense, if they think this is my territory, they're going to force, to get that territory. That's muscle flexing, and that's the new discourse. That's a new national narrative that is guiding China's thinking on all these issues. And therefore, India has to be sensitive to how to respond to some of this muscle flexing that Chinese are doing.
Absolutely. Einar, I hope you've got the answer. And frankly, this kind of an attitude and this repeated objection to the visits of Indian leaders is futile and churlish even.
Not at all. I think they objected to the fact that this leader was talking about, in essence, boycotting China, only dealing with ASEAN nations. I think this was a very clear message from them. But when you start putting together the analysis of what China has to gain, I still, the only thing you could say was muscle flexing. But what will China lose? China is embarked on an ambitious project to reach out regionally on an economic basis to connect up countries using physical means. It's WTO 2.0. Instead of just doing this by policy and talking about it for large corporations, what they're trying to do is move this to small, medium-sized enterprises. So if China were to engage in this kind of belligerent behavior by taking over lands surreptitiously, it would undo everything that they're trying to do on the economic front. So I still do not understand why you think that China is arbitrarily flexing its muscles against its own economic interests, which, if history serves as any guide, is an indication of that China always pursues its economic interests.
Well, we keep coming back to those questions. I think we'll have to settle it another day, but I'll give you the credit where it's due. You do a good job of defending the indefensible. Swaran Singh, I'm out of time, but I'm told you want to make a point very quickly, sir.
Very quickly, I think we should be careful of not misquoting. Einar mentioned Indian president's speech, including an expression of boycotting China. There was no such expression used in the speech made to the Legislative Assembly in Arunachal Pradesh. Only emphasis was we should try and expand trade with neighbors, and mention was made of ASEAN. China was not even mentioned. So I think we should avoid such wrong kind of interpretations that he spoke of boycotting China. And that's I think, very important at our level when we discuss these issues.
Absolutely. I'm going to thank you both, Einar Tangen, Professor Swaran Singh, for joining us here and adding your perspective. India and China, we know, recently held talks in Beijing on border affairs where both sides reviewed the situation and agreed to maintain peace. The two countries had agreed to withdraw troops from Doklam after a 73-day-long standoff on the 28th of August this year. The withdrawal happened just before the BRICS summit in China. The Doklam Plateau is a parcel of land claimed by Bhutan and China. Beijing has been trying to build a road through the disputed territory. China has also been claiming territory in Ladakh. Back in 2013, remember, the Chinese army was intercepted by Indian patrols repeatedly, and this led to a 3-week-long confrontation. Is China preparing ground for another one? We'll have to wait and see.